Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar, the value, importance, and the state of the world's wetlands and water birds. So we still have a few minutes before it starts officially. So let's wait for more audience to join in. So if you have any technical problem, you can also type your questions in the questions panel so that we will try to answer your questions regarding the technical issues. Yeah, we have a lot of audience today from Korea, from China, Singapore, Philippines, UK, of course, India, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Ireland. Wow, lots of people. Okay, let's get started. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Happy World Environment Day. Welcome to today's webinar, The Value, Importance, and State of the World's Wetlands and Water Birds. This is Vivian Fu, the Communication Officer of EAAFP Secretariat, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. I wish everyone is staying safe from the COVID-19 and hope that the situation is getting better at your side. Let me introduce about the World Environment Day. It is a UN day for encouraging worldwide awareness and action to protect our environments, celebrating on 5th of June every year. The theme of the World Environment Day this year is the Time for Nature, a call for actions to combat the accelerating species loss and degradation of natural world. In the East Asian-Australasian Flyway Partnership, the EAAFP, we have over 210 species, with 15% of them being globally threatened, mainly due to wetland habitat loss. Today, we have the honor to invite Professor Nick Davidson, Chair of the EAAFP Technical Sub-Committee, to talk about the global view on the values of wetlands and to share how stakeholders from all levels can play a role in conserving the wetlands and migratory water birds in the region. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's events. In your control panel of your computer screen, you will see a notepad icon. This is the handout section where you can find the handouts of the GoToWebinar attendees as troubleshooting notes, handouts from Professor Davidson, and the fact sheets about EAAFP. You are listening using your computer speaker system by default. We have over 73 attendees from all over the world now. So due to the larger audience attending, you will have the opportunity to submit the text questions to Professor Davidson by typing your question into the question panel. We will collect these questions and address them during the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Now let me introduce Professor Nick Davidson. Professor Davidson is an adjunct professor in the Institute of Land, Water and Society of Charles Sturt University and the chair of the EAAFP Technical Sub-Committee. As the Deputy Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands from the year 2000 to 2014, he played a senior advisor role in the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention with overall responsibility for the convention's global development and delivery of scientific, technical, and policy guidance, advice, as well as communications. He has long-standing experience in and a strong commitment to environmental sustainability, supported through the transfer of environmental science into policy relevance and decision-making at national and international scales. Professor Davidson, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivian. I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or possibly even good night, depending on where you're listening from. Let me see if I can put this now up to full screen. And Vivian, can you confirm that you can see the first slide of my presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, I will just hide that. So, what I want to talk today is to you about is the importance of wetlands, what we know about the value of wetlands, and then what we are finding out about the current and past state of our wetlands and the species such as waterbirds that depend on them. So it's highly relevant, I think, to the theme of this year's World Environment Day. So let's start with importance and ecosystem services. Back in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment described ecosystem services as the benefits people obtain from ecosystems, what you get from nature. And they grouped these type of services into 4 categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. All sorts of different values and benefits that people get from the natural environment. As part of the MA process, we developed a synthesis report on water and wetlands, derived from the huge wealth of information in the overall MA process. As part of that, we developed a qualitative expert opinion summary of the different ecosystem services provided by different wetland types. Now, you're not going to be able to read these, but basically across the top are different types of inland and marine coastal wetlands, and then the rows are the different types of ecosystem service. The most important thing to do is just look visually at the number of large black blobs. The bigger the blob, the more important that service is being delivered by that type of wetland. And you can see that overall, there are a lot of large blobs. So wetlands are very important to people in what they deliver to people. Just as a couple of examples, for example, mangroves, the major importance is for food, for fisheries and as fish nursery areas, timber, climate regulation, carbon storage becoming increasingly recognized, pollution control, particularly importantly, storm protection, and for their biodiversity. Similarly for lakes, major importance for food, for fish, for wild game, And of course, storage and provision and processing of fresh water, climate regulation, storing water, recharging groundwater reserves, flood control, and of course, importantly, spiritual and recreational value to people. Just two examples. In 2009, with some work we were doing with Ramsar and the Danone Fund for Nature, we developed that blob diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment a little bit and added human-made wetlands. And on the graphic, you can see here, again, it's human-made wetlands at the top, coastal wetlands, and then inland wetlands. The main point to make is across the whole range of different categories of wetland services, many different types of wetlands are delivering a lot of different services of great importance. But human-made wetlands deliver less than natural wetlands. So given this importance of the ecosystem services, how valuable are our wetlands? There's still a lot of argument going on over the last 20 years about whether doing an economic valuation of ecosystems is a good or a bad thing. And it's important to recognize that dollar values are only one part of the story, because you cannot put a dollar value on many types of ecosystem services, for example, cultural services. But that said, let's look at what the numbers tell us in terms of dollars. If you walked out into the street, well, you probably wouldn't meet many people now, given the coronavirus lockdown. But if you ask most people, what is the most valuable ecosystem in the world? I wonder what they would say. Well, the answer is that, tropical forest. Partly because the people involved in trying to achieve better tropical forest conservation have been very vocal and very good at promoting their cause. But is that correct? Let's have a look. The TEEB, which was the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity project, compiled information about the unit area, that per hectare value of different ecosystems, and plotted it on this graph. And it's important to note, as you'll see in a minute, that the bottom axis is a logarithmic scale. In other words, for every step in that scale, it's a 10-fold increase. So it's not a linear scale. And where do wetlands sit in this? Rivers and lakes about in the middle, and then inland wetlands, other inland wetlands, coastal systems, coral reefs to the right-hand side of the scale. So high values compared to even tropical forest. Now, why did the TEEB plot this on a logarithmic scale? It's quite simply so that you can see those values, because if you plot it on an absolute scale, on the right-hand side are our inland, coastal, wetlands, coral reefs, and you can see enormously high values compared to forests where you can barely see the little bar at the bottom of temperate forest, grassland, tropical forest. So wetlands have huge per hectare value to people. Recently, we revisited that value of wetlands and published a paper called The Worth of Wetlands. And that work used the values that have been published previously by the TEEB exercise for different wetlands, but applied new updated information on the global area of different types of wetlands that we have been preparing. What that gives us is that all natural wetlands have a minimum value of over $47 trillion annually, a huge amount. That's actually about twice the value for all types of forests. Inland wetlands is $27 trillion, and that's nearly 60% of all wetlands, and coastal wetlands is 20 trillion. Again, a high value. So, to summarize, wetlands have huge unit area value and very big total monetary value. And those values for coastal and inland wetlands are 43% of the global value of all types of biomes around the world. Particularly noticeable is coastal wetlands. They are less than 1% of the Earth's surface, so a narrow strip around the edge of the land. But they deliver nearly 20%, nearly 1/5 of the value of all biomes. So they are hugely important to us. Which types of wetlands are delivering this value? Well, most types of wetlands deliver value, particularly higher coral reefs, non-forested peatlands, and marshes and swamps. And it's really all about water. Somewhere between 80 and 95% of the value of different wetland types is to do with water, flood mitigation, groundwater recharge, storm surge, and so on. And also, importantly, carbon storage and sequestration. Where is this value being delivered around the world? On the left-hand pie chart is the surface area of different continents, regions of the world. On the right-hand pie chart, that's the percentage of the monetary value delivered by each region. And you can see Asia and North America, particularly high delivery. Africa, compared to its land surface, surprisingly small delivery of value to wetlands. There are a number of reasons for that I won't go into now, but if you want to ask me in the question and answer session, I'll try and explain. So we've looked at and confirmed that wetlands deliver an enormous range of important ecosystem services, benefits to people, and they have huge value. So in the light of this knowledge, have we been maintaining our wetlands, given this huge value? Well, I think the simple answer is no, regrettably, or at least not yet. So now let's look at what has been going on and what we've been doing to our wetlands. People have been converting wetlands in a piecemeal way for many centuries in many parts of the world. These are just two examples of the loss of area through wetland conversion and infilling of estuaries in Britain. The top left-hand graph is a trajectory from 1500 AD to the end of last century. And you can see nibbling away, filling in little bits for different purposes. And there's an example for the Tees estuary on the right of attempts to fill in a hugely internationally important tidal mudflat in the 1970s. I like that picture particularly because the truck on the right, the red one, sank and disappeared without trace, and they never got it back, but it was a small victory of the wetland over the overall infilling. So we've been converting wetlands, treating them as wastelands for many centuries. If we look at long-term and loss in the last century, it's possible, because this is only where records exist, it's important to stress that we may have destroyed nearly 90% of the wetlands we had in 1700 AD, and between 64–70% since 1900 AD. And it's carrying on, as I will show you. It's not stopping. The rate of loss, and this is perhaps the most important figure here, in the 20th century was nearly 4 times faster than in previous centuries. And those percentage losses were greatest in Asia and in Europe. And just some examples of the rates of loss from different regions. In Europe, you can see it's particularly high in the mid to late 20th century, slowed since then. North America, it's been a slower rate of loss and has been reducing a bit recently. But in Asia, it's a high rate and is continuing at a high rate. Just some examples of rates. The grey and black bars are UK estuaries, coastal USA and inland USA, and then the over time. And then the red, orange and yellow bars are rates of loss of wetlands in China and around the Yellow Sea. You can see with our technologies improving, we can reclaim or claim wetlands faster than we could before, and that has been happening, particularly in East Asia. Work building on that I've just shown you, we developed what is called the wet index, and it's an index which is calculated similar to the Living Planet index for species that you may well know about. So again, where records exist, we have an overall loss of wetlands since 1970 of 35%, just in 45 years, across all regions, both inland and coastal, and highest in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa. lowest rates of loss, lowest losses in North America and Oceania. And keep that pattern in mind, because that will come up again a number of times in what I'm going to show you in a minute. Perhaps most worryingly, if we look at the rate of loss since the 1970s, it was a fairly steady rate of loss until about 2010. But in the following 5 years, the most recent 5 years, that rate of loss almost doubled. So rather than reducing the rate of loss, as the CBD earlier targets called for, we have been accelerating the rate of loss. We're going in the wrong direction for wetlands. That's natural wetlands. What about human-made wetlands? Well, completely the opposite trend to natural. The change in extent of human-made wetlands increased by over 200% since 1970, and that's particularly because of increased areas of rice production and damming for reservoirs. So what about the state of the species that depend on our wetlands? Well, given what I showed you about the extent and continuing losses, it's not surprising they are not in a good state. Ramsar's Global Wetland Outlook, which I commend to you if you haven't yet read it, which was produced in 2018 and to which I contributed on the wetland areas and changes. Put it bluntly, wetland-dependent species are increasingly threatened with extinction. And the Living Planet Index, as an example of this that I mentioned earlier, shows us that population sizes of freshwater species, you can see the blue arrow on the bottom right-hand side of this graph, have declined globally by over 80% since 1970. And that's a much, much greater decline than those for species depending on any other ecosystem. So not only are we facing a global biodiversity crisis, but that crisis is particularly critical for wetlands. Similarly, the IUCN Red List of globally threatened species, the Red List index calculated for birds, mammals, amphibians, and corals, shows us that all of them are increasingly moving towards extinction. Those lines on the graph are going down. So we have real problems with the species that depend on wetlands, not unexpectedly. Overall, from the Red List, from work we did for the Global Wetland Outlook, over 25% of species of many types of wetland-dependent taxa are globally threatened with extinction. And you can see the red numbers there are those that are over 25%. Now, just to look at one type of wetland-dependent species, waterbirds, particularly close to my heart. If you look at the global species level threat status, the Red List status, it's quite low compared to other taxa, but it's still 18% are globally threatened. But that's a Red List is a rather crude measure because it's only at the species level. And for migratory waterbirds, it's their biogeographic populations that are more relevant to look at. And many were in a poor and deteriorating state between the 1960s and 2000s. And in 2005, compared to 18% of species, nearly 50% of populations were decreasing. And long-distance migrant waterbirds are particularly in trouble. But there is a little bit of good news in the story. On these graphs, and I will show you a number of graphs like this with the left axis being an index of ecological character status, in this case, the population status. Anything that is above the bar, above 0, is good news. Anything below the bar is bad news. You can see that across all flyways for migratory birds on that left-hand graph, we're below the bar. We've got more populations declining than increasing. For resident shorebirds, it's slightly better news. They're in rather better state. If you look at for 3 flyways, East Atlantic, North America, and East Asia, Australasia, over time, from the figures for the 20th century, late 20th century, and in the 2010s, you can see we're all below the bar. We're all in trouble. East Atlantic Flyway is not too bad a state, but has deteriorated. The good news is for North America and America's flyways, fairly good state, and it has improved recently in the number of a reduced number of populations in decline. But for East Asia or Australasia, as is widely recognized, these migratory waterbirds are in serious trouble and getting in a worse and worse state. So what about what we've got left, what we haven't converted yet? What's the state of our remaining wetlands? And that's been a surprisingly big gap in our knowledge base. And the Society of Wetland Scientists, SWS Ramsar section, which I currently chair, recognized this and has done some work to try and assess the state of our remaining wetlands. And we have two new recently published assessments, published last year, about the status and trends in what we call the ecological character of our remaining wetlands. One was the Citizen Science Survey, which we conducted in 2017, and I will tell you a little bit more about what next on that. And the other was looking at what Ramsar contracting parties, Ramsar governments, have said in their official national reports to Ramsar over 3 recent cycles. And that's looking at the trends in the state of wetlands generally and of Ramsar sites, wetlands of international importance in particular. You can ask me for those papers through ResearchGate if you would like to have access to them. So let's look at the Citizen Science Survey story first. And we asked about the current state of wetlands and then about the trends in the state of wetlands. So if we look at the current state, and again on this graph, above the 0 bar is good or relatively good, below the 0 bar is bad. Now, encouragingly, citizen scientists reported that more wetlands were reported as being currently good condition than in poor. And you can see on the right-hand side globally, that's a little bit above the bar. But again, as we saw for the wet index, most widespread reports of poor state come from Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe, with best in Oceania and North America. So that's the current state of what's out there. How has that state been changing? Not such good news. Many more wetlands were reported as deteriorating in state than improving. And there was that more widespread deterioration than improvement in 5 of the 6 Ramsar regions, with the exception being, surprisingly perhaps, a small improvement in Asia. And again, deterioration particularly widespread in Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa, those 2 big low bars on the left-hand side. There's also worryingly, what we might call a widening divide in the state of wetlands and their trends. It's a little complicated to see, but on the left-hand axis is the trend in state, with red being major deterioration up to dark green at the top being major improvement. And then looking at what's happening with wetlands that are in currently poor state, currently fair state, currently good state, what we've found is that wetlands in currently good state, that's the right-hand bar, are generally improving or not getting worse. Whereas on the left-hand bar, those in poor state, 70% of them are deteriorating further. So if we look at what the citizen scientists said about trending wetland state for Ramsar sites and other wetlands, they're not designated as Ramsar, we would expect, given the importance and the recognition of Ramsar sites being designated as internationally important, they would be maintained and be in a better state than wetlands that don't have such recognition. But citizen scientists have told us that more Ramsar sites were deteriorating than other non-designated wetlands, and that is should be a particular worry for the Ramsar Convention and its governments as to why that is happening. Let's turn to what the governments say. So here's the trend in the state of all wetlands, or wetlands generally. Again, it's coming up with a similar story. Across the different regions and globally, it's not good. Again, more widespread deterioration than improvement. And for the 2 cycles we have here, it was a worse state in 2014 reported, a more widespread deterioration reported by governments, national governments, than in 2011. And again, worse in Latin America and Africa. Ramsar sites, the story reported by governments is much more encouraging, much better. There's more widespread improvement in the deterioration to Ramsar sites reported by governments. But again, a worse state in 2014 than 2011. So if we look across those three cycles of Ramsar reporting by governments, first of all, Ramsar sites, that's the black bars, are being consistently reported as in a better state than wetlands generally, but increasingly widespread deterioration going on over time for both wetlands generally and Ramsar sites. Again, a worrying result, and that's from official government reporting. If we compare what citizen scientists are telling us, that's the orange bars, and what governments are telling us, the blue, for wetlands generally, there's reasonable consistency in view that there's more widespread deterioration than improvement. Although interestingly, citizen scientists seem to be more optimistic about wetlands generally than do governments. Conversely, for Ramsar sites, citizen scientists are much more pessimistic than governments. They are reporting a much more widespread deterioration than our governments. We can only speculate why there may be such difference. And as I mentioned, the Citizen Science Survey in 2017, we have just launched a repeat survey for 2020, which we would encourage all of you listening to contribute to yourselves and also to share as widely as possible with your networks of wetland people to encourage everyone who knows a wetland to contribute. We want to see if we detect changes in the state of wetlands reported now compared to 3 years ago. There's an online survey. It should take you only 10 to 15 minutes to complete if you know about a wetland. And that survey is available in multiple languages, 7 languages, English, French, Arabic, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. And if you want to contribute, you click on these web links and that takes you to the survey in the language of your choice. Please, everybody, help inform us, and we will aim to report the findings of this survey as part of the Ramsar Convention's 50th anniversary celebrations next year. So what's the problem? Where's the problem coming from? What's driving this deterioration in the state of wetlands? If we look at what we might call proximate drivers from the Citizen Science Survey, 3 were reported as positive, linked to improvement of the state of wetlands, and that's local community awareness, actually doing something on the ground in terms of conservation management and tourism. But there are many, many others that are widely reported as negative, are causing pressure on wetlands. And it's the usual culprits of pollution, invasive species, and conversion for urban, industrial, and agricultural development. But despite this rather depressing story about the overall state and change in the state of our wetlands, of course, an awful lot has been done and is being done to implement actions for wetlands and waterbirds around the world. And given that this is a webinar organized by the East Asia-Australasia Flyway Partnership, let's just have a look at migratory waterbirds, which of course need concerted and cooperative action at the flyway scale. And here are, on this map, at a broad scale, the north-south flyways of migratory waterbirds. You can't safeguard migratory waterbirds if you only try and do conservation management in your patch. There's got to be concerted and consistent action across the whole flyway. And in recognition of that, there have been a whole range of different global and flyway scale initiatives and agreements developed. Some of the earliest being in the Americas in the 1918 Migratory Birds Treaty Act. And you can see more recently on the timeline, down at the bottom right-hand corner, is the East Asia-Australasia Flyway Partnership. Partnership is interesting because it's unique among all these different waterbird flyway initiatives because it's a public-private sector partnership. It's not just between governments. It's got 36 partners, national governments, NGOs, international NGOs, MEAs, environmental conventions, and private sector companies. It's also recognized by the Ramsar Convention as a Ramsar regional initiative. and it provides key flyway scale mechanism to support and encourage everybody to maintain and restore coastal inland wetlands for waterbirds on the flyway. One of those tools is the identification and designation of particularly important wetlands on the flyway as flyway network sites. And so far there have been, when I last checked, 146 flyway network sites covering over 23 million hectares recognized by the partnership. But there are many more, and earlier analysis suggested that we're in excess of 900 wetlands that could and should be designated as flyway network sites. So there's a way to go in this process, but progress is encouraging. So just to summarize where we've got to, overall, the goal established by the Ramsar Convention in 1971 of stemming encroachment on and degradation of wetlands, we're not achieving it after nearly 50 years, despite the many wise use decisions, actions, and individual successes that we know of worldwide. This means we're not going to achieve the 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets that were established through the Biodiversity Convention process, and we're not on track to deliver the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And we know that the drivers of wetland loss and degradation are continuing directly, conversion to other land uses, pollution, invasives, and indirectly from upstream water diversions and abstractions. So why are we allowing this to still happen? We have a strong evidence base of the huge importance of wetlands, but we're carrying on ignoring that importance. So why? Well, let's look at three questions. Is it that governments are not doing enough implementation of their commitments under agreements such as the Ramsar Convention or CBD? Do we have any evidence for that? Is it that wetlands will be in an even worse state if it wasn't for all the implementation that governments are doing and others are doing for wetland management and conservation? Or thirdly, is it that there is something else overriding all of this action, that the ultimate drivers, the big drivers, are they overriding all sectoral conservation efforts? Because whatever you do, they're going to take precedence. These are not mutually exclusive questions, and I think there's a little bit of evidence we can develop, and we're looking for further evidence for each of these. So first of all, what are governments doing? Are they doing enough? Probably the answer is no, if you look at their implementation and what they report every 3 years in their national reports of their implementation of the strategic plan Ramsar actions that they've committed to. There's a huge range of national implementation extent on this graph, from 7% in one country to what is reported as over 85%. But if you look at the average, on average, countries are reporting they're only implementing half of their actions they commit to in delivering the Ramsar strategic plan. And interestingly, most regions are quite similar across in terms of averages. But as I said, there's a huge range of individual country differences across that. Why is there such a difference in extent of implementation? We're not entirely sure, but one possibility is in part it's to do with the issue of capacity and resourcing to implement the actions committed to. And we do have a bit of evidence if you look at gross domestic product, GDP, in relation to the percentage implementation that that country is reporting. There is a positive correlation so that the more wealthy countries are doing more implementation of Ramsar than poor countries. So, second question, would wetlands be in a worse state if it wasn't for implementing Ramsar? And there is some evidence that says yes. Looking at the information I showed you about the state and trends of wetlands and the percentage of the proportion of actions of Ramsar being implemented, parties reporting an improved wetland state, that's the right-hand pair of bars for both wetlands generally and Ramsar sites, are on average doing more types of implementation of Ramsar than those reporting deteriorating state, the left-hand pair of bars. So the more you do, the more likely you are to be reporting also your wetlands are improving. The less you do, the more likely you are to be reporting your wetlands are deteriorating. What sort of implementation do you need for success to report positive improvement of wetlands? And from some analyses we've been doing, it looks like you need to have two types of implementation. You need, first of all, a national level authorizing environment, like a national wetland policy, national legislation, and so on. And then you need to do on the ground activities which are enabled by having that national level policy framework. But so far, less than half of Ramsar parties have developed a national wetland policy. So without an overarching policy framework to enable on the ground actions, it is unlikely you will be successful in achieving that delivery. So more needs to be done in terms of developing policies by all countries. So then the third question, are the impacts for what we might call ultimate drivers, the big scale drivers, overriding all other efforts? The answer is probably yes, but there are very few analyses. There is one example from Amano and colleagues in Nature looking at trends in waterbird populations in relation to a number of different global drivers. And what they concluded was successful conservation of waterbird populations depends on effective national governance. And secondly, that higher wetland protected area coverage, this is something which everybody is pushing for, more and more protected areas. Yes, that does support increasing waterbird populations, but only if it's in countries that have good governance. In other words, the overarching enabling framework of good governance allows people on the ground to manage their protected areas successfully. And we're now undertaking some further analysis through SWS Ramsar section to try and explore links between these ultimate drivers and the data we have on wetland state and trends, looking at indices of good governance, enforcement of legislation, corruption, press freedom, population growth, economic growth, and so on. And one preliminary finding we have is it seems like it's the rate of change of GDP, gross domestic product, that is one of the strongest drivers of reported state of wetlands. The faster you're growing economically, the more likely you are to report your wetlands are deteriorating. So in other words, it's still that rapid economic growth seems to be overriding environmental protection as a priority. Given the situation we're in, a global biodiversity crisis, with wetlands facing as big or bigger a crisis than any ecosystem, I think we can say arguably that intergovernmental agreements such as Ramsar and Biodiversity Convention, Convention on Migratory Species, have consistently failed to deliver enough to safeguard our world's wetlands over the last 50 years. But those processes are just seem to be continuing business as usual. Through the CBD, there are currently a process to develop yet more biodiversity targets to replace the failing current targets. So if the current targets have failed, what's the likelihood that any new target is going to be delivered unless it's made much easier to achieve? So I think we need to step out of the box of traditional ways of approaching wetland nature conservation and wise use. And we need to think what else might be done to try and improve the state of wetlands. And there are various ideas flying around. One I've seen recently is the idea of establishing national wetland commissions within a country, across all government and societal sectors, to try and better coordinate and bring together with a common cause all parts of government at all levels. There's also discussion being going on about the idea of treating ecocide as an international crime in a similar way as genocide is recognized as an international crime. And then finally, through some discussions over the last year or so with a group of Society of Wetland Scientists colleagues, we have been exploring the idea of developing a universal declaration of the rights of wetlands. There's already such a declaration on the rights of rivers that's been established, and we are preparing the discussion on that, and we've just submitted a paper with these ideas and the rationale behind it very recently. So on that one, watch this space, and we'd be very interested if anybody wants to engage in the discussions on the idea of a declaration, the pros and the cons of trying to come up with something. But I do think, given the state you can see I've reported about our wetlands and the deterioration of them continuing, just carrying on business as usual is no longer an option if we want to care about our wetlands and have them for the benefits of people in the future. Thank you very much indeed for your time and attention. And thank you, Vivian.
Right, okay. Thank you, Professor Davidson, for the inspiring presentation. So we are now going to begin answering the questions submitted during the presentation. And because we have about 100 attendees today, so you are still having the chance for sending the text question to us to ask Professor Davidson. So you can submit your questions through the question section in the control panel, and then yeah, you can also press the raise hand button to alert us. So first of all, our first question is from Dr. Gupi. To Professor Davidson, could you explain why the natural wetland area change rate increased or decreased? So the question again is, could you explain why the natural wetlands area change rates would increase or decreased?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but we know that natural wetlands are under pressure of conversion by people for other purposes. And also the ecological character state of them is under pressure from increased pollution, for example, and the spread of invasive species. We are converting natural wetlands, creating human-made wetlands, such as reservoirs and so on, at the expense of our natural wetlands, but that's not the whole story. There's a general pattern that emerges from a number of studies that have been undertaken, for example, around the Mediterranean basin, where what you see happening is a two-stage process of the loss and conversion of wetlands. The first stage is the conversion of a natural wetland drainage for mainly agriculture, increasing areas of food production. And then secondly, those agricultural areas are being converted and destroyed with increasing urbanization, the spread of human populations. And so there are a whole range of reasons why we see continuing loss of natural wetlands, and it will undoubtedly differ in different parts of the world. But the overall particularly worrying point, I think, is from the Wet Index, suggesting that where records exist, instead of reducing the rate of loss of wetlands, recently we have been managing to increase the rate of loss. We're going in the wrong direction. I hope that answers a little bit of your question. Thank you.
Okay, our second question is from Laura. Could there be any reporting bias towards the Ramsar sites where greater deterioration is identified in comparison to non-Ramsar sites? So I will repeat the question from Laura again. Could there be any reporting bias towards Ramsar sites where greater deterioration is identified in comparison to non-Ramsar sites?
Very good question. Yes, the answer is there are undoubtedly biases in these data sets, but they are the best we've got at the moment to start telling the story. If one takes the government reporting, the Ramsar contracting party reporting, in once every 3 years national reports, which are formal convention documents, one has to take what our governments tell us as accurate and factual. If I was still working as the Deputy Secretary General for Ramsar, that would be the end of my statement. I no longer am, and we have undoubted evidence in some ways that what governments are putting, at least some governments are putting in their national reports, may not necessarily accurately reflect the situation. It is not perhaps unexpected that governments would want to tell us that the Ramsar sites they have designated and committed to maintaining the ecological character of these wetlands are in a good state. The fact that citizen scientists seem to be saying the much more widespread deterioration of Ramsar sites than governments is perhaps therefore not unexpected. The possible biases in the citizen science data set. Well, interestingly, one of the questions we asked in the survey, and if you go on and do the 2020 survey, you'll see that question again, was, is this wetland a Ramsar site or not? And one thing when we were preparing the data for analysis became very clear that a lot of respondents were reporting on what is actually a designated Ramsar site, but didn't know it. So if you like, there's a kind of control there that says they reported the state of a wetland regardless of whether they knew it was a Ramsar site or not. And so I'm quite comfortable with the sort of findings and the results we've got from that survey. Citizen science is being increasingly recognized as a remarkably powerful approach, recognizing it always has some limitations and challenges, but it can enrich the story wonderfully. And it has, from the analyses I showed you, thrown up that very point about the question you've just asked me. Are our governments actually being honest with the world about the state of their wetlands or not? I leave that as a question hanging in the air. Thank you very much.
So there is one question from Mika Yasuta. How to maintain the status of the flyway / Ramsar sites? Is it possible to achieve by using some kind of new tourism or awareness raising program? Who should we be targeting for? So to repeat the question from Mika, how to maintain the status of the flyway / Ramsar sites? Is it possible to achieve by using some kind of new tourism or awareness raising program? Who should we be targeting for?
Oh. Hello, Mika. Thank you for that question. Your questions are always very challenging. Ultimately, it's a matter of commitment to maintain them by governments and local communities. And I think the link between, as I said, national authorizing environment of national governments committing and establishing frameworks to enable on-the-ground maintenance and conservation of these sites is great, but if you don't then engage with the local communities and work with them, and we have some very good examples of how awareness raising with local communities, increasing recognition in local communities of the importance of the site. It's not just important to you, it's not just nationally important, this is internationally important. You're the custodians of a really special place. And there have been 3 surveys done of Ramsar site managers some years ago now in USA, Canada, and in Africa, saying, has the designation of your wetland as a Ramsar site helped you maintain it or manage it? And the remarkably consistent pattern came out that said, yes, it's helped me as the responsible officer for that wetland work with local communities, as I've just said, to increase their awareness and interest in engagement and their pride in the wetland. And it's also helped me get some more funds to manage it. And so I think everybody, it's hard to identify who you should be targeting to get this improved. Everybody can play a role, and that's where the Flyway Partnership comes in, as bringing the different actors, types of players together, of governments, private sector, companies, NGOs, and then to go out and work with your local communities. And ecotourism certainly is an approach. It's kind of sometimes seen as the ultimate panacea, the ultimate solution. Let's get more tourists in. They'll bring us more money, recognition of the site. But as we know from a number of World Heritage sites, you can do overkill. If you promote it too much, you get too many people, and there you end up destroying the very feature that people come to the site place for. So there's a balance. And as I showed in the citizen science survey drivers, more people said tourism, ecotourism, was a positive than said it was a negative, but there were people saying it's negative as well. Thank you.
Great. So another questions, which is about the citizen science, is from Prof. Wing. The question is, can citizen science results be relied to apply for wetland conservation? Because wetlands are related to socio-economic conditions, they are to use the wetlands for short-term rather than the long-term conservation. To repeat the questions from Prof. Thusa Win, can citizen science results be relied to apply for wetland conservation? Because wetlands are related to socio-economic conditions, they are to use the wetlands for short-term rather than the long-term conservation.
Thank you. Yes, so I think the quite simple problem, you just said it in your question, the reason why we're still losing wetlands is for all sorts of reasons. The world focuses on short-term socio-economic gain rather than the longer-term story that's needed to maintain wetlands. And there are sometimes obviously very good reasons. Locally, with population growth, people in poor countries desperately need to feed their families, and that's their priority. And if that means draining a wetland to grow crops or graze cattle on it, that's what will happen. So this is where the overarching approach is to try and find solutions to these big challenges of poverty reduction and so on are essential if the consequence is going to be people better caring about their wetlands. Citizen science approaches, they can help inform the story. And just to note that with the 2017 Citizen Science Survey, we had responses from a wide range of different types of people, from national governments, from NGOs, from local landowners, local communities, and so on. And so I didn't show you that part of the story, but there are some interesting additional stories also in the published paper about what different categories of people said. And broadly, some were more optimistic than others, more positive than others. But the important point, I think, is that before we did these two surveys and types of analysis, there was really no global and regional information out there about what is actually happening to our remaining wetlands. And we need to do more, both in countries and on the ground, to track what's happening and track the successes. What are the necessary, where are things working positively? And one thing we found in the Citizen Science Survey was there was quite a strong link between the state of the wetland being reported and its size. That's a negative correlation. So in other words, the smaller the wetland, the more likely it is to be reported as in a good state or improving. The bigger the wetland, the more likely it was reported as in a deteriorating poor state. So essentially, you could interpret that in part as being, with a small wetland, it's discrete. Maybe it's a nature reserve being managed as a nature reserve with a fence around it to keep people out or whatever. It's manageable and in a good state. Very, very large wetlands are probably not manageable in the traditional wetland management planning sense. So if you designate as a Ramsar site half, for example, the Congo Basin, a huge area, it's unlikely that it will be more than, if you like, a paper park. On paper, it's designated and recognized, but actually practically trying to find ways on the ground of maintaining that wetland against all the various multiple pressures over huge geographical areas is perhaps impossible. So we're very good, or much better, at looking after little wetlands than we are at looking after the big and really important ones. A bit of a conundrum. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. So I found the one question is like, can be a follow-up. It's this one is from Sipto. The question is, do you have any advice how to manage natural wetlands that's actively used by local people and in the same time are the habitats of migratory shorebirds? So the question again is, do you have any advice on how to manage natural wetlands that are actively used by local people and in the same time are the habitats of migratory shorebirds?
I'm not an expert in that, but it's a very important question. Thank you, Sipto. One of the key points about the whole construct of the Ramsar Convention is it's not a wetland protection convention. It's a wetland wise use, a wetland sustainable use convention. So, for example, the designation of a Ramsar site doesn't mean you have to take all the people out of the wetland. It's recognized that in many cases, it's the fact that people have been there and used the wetland for many centuries that has led to it still being there and to its importance. And people or local communities are crucial. In many ways, if you have local communities using a wetland, provided it is not over-exploitation, then it's a benefit, because it is likely they will care about their wetland because that's where their livelihoods come from, where their survival comes from. In many cases, that's very clear. And so if others try to damage that wetland, they will resist it. And I think the key is working with local communities. I mean, in the East Asia region, and the examples of communities working with and looking after the wintering crane populations, for example, and helping to maintain them, is a long-standing linkage between people and migratory waterbirds, and certainly encouraging the spectacle of large flocks of migratory waterbirds is something that attracts people, bird watchers, tourists, and so on. And if that can benefit local communities so that they see the potential of some income, agro-tourism or whatever, of people coming to see their wetland because it's so important, then that encourages and gives them some benefit of maintaining the wetland, not just for themselves, but also for the migratory waterbirds. But I can't stress so strongly, you cannot safeguard a wetland if it's not supported by and done by the people who live and depend upon it. You might get an initial success, and it's the same with wetland restoration. You can restore scientifically and technically a wetland very successfully indeed. There you are, it's done. But if you don't have the engagement of the people around it to care about it and look after it, the evidence is that that restoration will fail because people are not engaged in it. So you have to start with people. If you don't start with people right at the start, you don't go and impose things on the local community. You work with them and work out with them what their best sustainable livelihood is, what an alternative livelihood is if there's overexploitation going on of fisheries, for example. Can we develop alternative livelihoods that will give them the same or more income than what they're currently gaining, to the benefit of both them and the biodiversity? Crucially, it's about people. And it's bottom up and not totally top down in the process. Thank you.
Wow, that's a really good answer for encouraging and reminding us to always engage the local communities when managing or conserving a wetlands. And we have different type of questions. It's from Yus, and actually a few audience also asked these questions. It's about, can you slightly explain the rationale behind the proposed Universal Declaration of Wetlands Rights? So the question again is, Professor Davidson, can you slightly explain the rationale behind the proposed Universal Declaration of Wetlands Rights?
Oh, I'm not sure I can in the space of a minute or so. It's started with a presentation last year at the Society of Wetland Scientists Conference by somebody called Gillian Davis, who'll be much better able to answer your question, talking about the way in which people over time have essentially recognized that nature has intrinsic rights itself to exist, not the human-based approach that we need to conserve nature because. And this led to a number of discussions to explore the idea, recognizing that there are a number of declarations of the rights of nature in one form or other out there. I mentioned there is an existing one on the rights of rivers. There are also a number of local or national declarations and legal frameworks being established in a number of parts of the world, a number of countries, particularly linked with indigenous peoples and their recognition of the intrinsic right of nature to exist, rather than the human-based approach of we need nature because we need it. And so we started exploring this further to see if there is a way of taking forwards an idea based on some of these other intrinsic rights initiatives that are already there, to look at something more globally universal that could be then picked up and used by people to help better safeguard their wetlands. It's a work in process. We have one short paper which was published in Wetlands Science and Practice, in this WS magazine, recently, and we're preparing another one, which the paper that we have out there would give some further insights into where we're thinking. It's very much a discussion in progress at the moment, and we can see both positives and negatives of it. But we also, as part of this work, have mined back into a timeline of recognition of the rights of nature in one form or another in different parts of the world over time. And this goes back many, many, many centuries in some cultures. So we'll be able to provide some more information, but if, for example, you want to send me an email, I can share with you the Wetland Science and Practice, which was actually bringing together a summary of what we were planning to present as a symposium in the Society of Wetland Scientists and Society of Ecological Restoration RE3 conference, which should have been taking place this week in Quebec in Canada, but of course with the coronavirus issues that's been postponed. And we are aiming to discuss further this idea of wetland rights declaration at a number of conferences and meetings, Society of Wetland Scientists, Intercol in New Zealand, which will now be next year as well, and so on. So I'm happy to share with you what we have at the moment, but watch this space because there will be more information about the overall rationale. But I think it starts from feeling that we can't just sit there and do nothing and let business as usual just carry on, because it has not delivered over 50 years and it's not likely to change the way it's currently operating. Well, what else can we do to give another set of tools into people's hands that might help them help wetlands? That's the basis of the starting point. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, please follow EAAFP channels, and we can help deliver the conferences and the updates of all these decision-making processes. And we have a few more questions. I would really like to extend a little bit because I wanted to cater as many questions as we can. This one is from Aaron. He's asking, how can understanding the way communities use wetlands ecosystem services be helpful in informing land use decision making by local government units that work towards conservation? So Aaron's question is, how can understanding the way communities use wetlands ecosystem services be helpful in informing land use decision-making by local government units that work towards conservation? I think it's about how to convince the government.
Yes, convincing the governments is always a challenge. Because one of the problems we know is that the parts of government, whether it's local government or national government, that have responsibility for environment ministries and so on, are often at the bottom end of the pile of the ranking of ministries and their influence. And we know that in many cases, no matter how determined and committed, for example, our Ramsar focal points are, their views and what they're trying to achieve can be readily ignored and overridden by more powerful ministries, economic development, industry, energy, and so on. So there's a struggle. Working with local communities, again, I think is vitally important. One of the first things that can be done is, again, to get better knowledge, because with a knowledge base, then you can start talking with governments to show them the evidence base. I know that governments often are not very keen on hearing that evidence base, but working with local communities to understand and capture what types of ecosystem service they benefit from their wetland is a key starting point. And some of you may be aware that adopted by Ramsar at its last conference of parties was something called the rules, a rapid assessment tool for wetland ecosystem services, and that's been very successfully used and applied in a number of wetlands in different countries and different parts of the world. And we're using it at the moment in a big wetland wise use project in Myanmar, jointly between the Norway government and the Myanmar government, to help understand livelihoods around Ramsar sites, communities living in and around Ramsar sites. What are they currently gaining from the wetland, and where and how does it all work? And where are the potential issues that might need then developing ways with the local communities, the local villagers, of ways of functioning a bit differently, as long as they are not disadvantaged. And it's a great starting point, because you can say, did you realize you're getting all this pollination benefit from your mangroves? Oh, no, we didn't realize that. And that's vital for bees and pollination and maintaining pollinating your crops and so on. So there are stories you can then tell from that knowledge, which I think are very helpful to explain to governments and local governments why they need to support their local communities in maintaining the wetland, not destroying it.
Okay, so yeah, that's a good advice. And yeah, let's have one more questions. That is from Paloma. The question is, how do we got about managing the non-Ramsar sites, as they are usually not considered, but most of them does harbor good number of migratory shorebirds. So Paloma's question is, how do we got about managing the non-Ramsar sites, as they are usually not considered, but most of them does harbor good number of migratory shorebirds?
Yes, indeed, many do. And the Ramsar criteria for waterbirds, of course, there are two to identify and recognize as international importance of the site. That's supporting regularly more than 20,000 waterbirds at any one time, and supporting more than 1% of the population of one or more species of waterbirds on the site. That works particularly well, and there's quite a lot of material in the past out there in the development of these criteria and testing them. Works well for congregatory species, because it doesn't work well for species that are very dispersed, scattered over the whole landscape, using lots and lots of small wetlands. And just reflecting on work I did decades back on assessing the importance of UK estuaries, for a significant number of even relatively congregatory species, a high percentage of their population in the UK were on non-Ramsar wetlands. So the approach under Ramsar is the recognition of particularly important sites for waterbirds. But there are other criteria in the Ramsar toolkit which can be applied more broadly in maintaining the range of biodiversity in a particular area and so on. And essentially anywhere that supports migratory waterbirds, given that they're in serious decline, many of them in the East Asia Flyway, is important. And we need to get that message across. But we can use waterbirds sometimes as flagship species to tell the story, but we need to look more broadly at livelihoods and people's uses of wetlands, because many wetlands, if you have a mosaic of small wetlands, if you take them together, they may be delivering a huge amount to people in terms of recharging groundwater or managing water and so on. And if you have water, you'll get a waterbird sitting on it. Thanks.
Okay, so that was our last questions, but there are actually several audience asked how to be in touch with you. I guess later on we can talk with Professor Davidson about your contacts, and then we can send to you via our email. There will be a follow-up email. So thank you again to
just on that point, Vivian. Yes, if any of the attendees would like to have a copy of any of the recently published papers that I mentioned, you can find them all on ResearchGate, but you will, through ResearchGate, need to send me a personal request for me to share the paper, because of copyright reasons we can't post them widely for public access. So the Worth of Wetlands paper, the papers on the stages and trends of remaining wetlands. There are also papers we've published recently on the adequacy of reporting mechanisms on wetlands through the Ramsar Convention. So if you look for me on ResearchGate, you should find those papers there. Send me a ResearchGate request and I'm happy to share them. And for yours, the paper, an article I mentioned about in Wetland Science and Practice about the Universal Declaration of Wetland Rights, maybe if you just can provide Vivian with email address, I can then send that directly to you. Thank you.
Okay, we're happy to receive that. So thank you again to Professor Davidson for bringing us this really inspiring webinar and answering all these different questions about wetlands conservation. So, and also I would like to thank you everyone for joining us. Please join the World Wetland Survey mentioned by Professor Davidson. So in our following follow-up emails, I will include the links. And you can follow more about EAAFP's activities on our website and social media channels, which you can see on the screen now. And once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the survey mentioned by Professor Davidson. And also, we also want you to give us some feedback on the presentation. So this email will also include a link to view the recording of today's webinar. And we also will post this recording to YouTube later on. On behalf of the EAAFP and our presenter, Professor Nick Davidson, thank you for joining us today, and your continuous support and interest are really encouraging to our conservation work and to save the migratory waterbirds. Please feel free to reach us via emails or other channels. Have a good day and happy
and thank you very much, Vivian, for inviting me to celebrate World Environment Day with everybody and to give the presentation. I've very much enjoyed doing it, and I hope it's given people some new ideas and new ways of thinking about what we do about wetlands. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for listening.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice weekend.